Welcome to Shadowshiver, a podcast that tells real or imaginary horror stories. It's up to you, believe it.
I was terrified to turn around after witnessing the horrors on the DVDs. I feared that anything could be behind me, but I felt something like spiders along my skin. My head moved without permission. I slowly twisted, terrified of what I would see. I shut my eyes. Maybe if I didn't look, it couldn't hurt me. I tried as hard as I could to keep my eyes shut, but they were deliberately pulled open. My own fingers were the one to force the lid apart. I hadn't even felt my arms move when I could see properly. It was almost a relief. There was no one behind me. I had gotten into my head that a crazed John would be standing there ready to enact his torture upon me. Luckily, that was just a fantasy. I stood. It was impossible not to shiver. I was exhausted after watching those disturbing videos. I felt almost as if I'd gone through them myself. Maybe a meal or some water would help. But before I could even go, I noticed something out of the ordinary on the bookcase behind the table. There was a camera. There was sitting innocently between two of my favorite books. I don't remember owning a camera. There was a small red blinking light on the top. From some way in my memory, I recognized this as meaning it needed its battery changed. I approached the camera as though it were a wild animal. When I lifted it, the weight surprised me. It was dull black and thoroughly used and dented. But it worked. It was losing power, but it had been recording. It was set up perfectly to view my back, the table, and my computer. I brought the camera closer to my chest, and it immediately died. The screen was blacker than anything I had seen, and I saw myself in the darkness. I needed to move on. I needed to put the camera down and get out of there, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready, or was it that I wasn't able? I sat back down at the table. Instinctively, I knew how to eject the memory card from the camera. It popped out and lay in my palm. I knew then that this was the third video I had to watch. It wasn't a DVD, it hadn't truly been delivered to me, but this is what I had to watch next. I put the memory card into the slot on my computer. It prompted up a folder on the screen. I clicked to open it, but instead I opened a strange folder on my desktop. The folder was C, and there were three subfolders: prisoner, luck, and death, in that order. I tried to click the prisoner folder, but it wouldn't open. The same thing happened with luck. The death folder opened without issue. Within there were three video files: the man in black, the door, and Margaret is not Margaret. The man in black begins with running. Margaret runs across the room. She is screaming in almost an inhuman voice. The camera person is trying to catch her. They follow her from room to room, getting closer and closer. In one sickening shot, she looks behind her shoulder, and her face is one of pure terror. This was the first time I really saw Margaret's fear. Finally, Margaret trips over a rug. The camera person is upon her. Instantly she cries and struggles, but is held down. It doesn't take long for the camera to fall beside the pair as expected. It is John on top of her. He's still wearing his ski mask and gloves. It becomes clear that John is just holding her down. He doesn't try to hurt her or anything else more sinister. Margaret fights like her life depends on it, and there are 3 solid minutes of her fighting like the other videos. I couldn't look away. It was difficult to watch, but I was stuck. It was like I had my own John holding me in the chair. Finally, Margaret calms down. She looks into his face, and they stare at each other like strangers. Margaret starts to laugh. She's racked with laughter in the same way she was racked with sobs just minutes earlier. Her body rattles with the sound she makes. John doesn't let go. He says, "You've forgotten the face of your father." She bends upward, pushing her face toward his. "He has no face, John, you know that." John is clearly angered by this. "He has a face, a strong face, the place to where face was faced. Show me." Then she lays back against the floor. "Show me my father's face." John sits up, crossing his arms. He's mouthing words, but nothing makes sense. Margaret does not seem surprised by this odd behavior. Maybe he had done this before. Maybe he had often mouthed unintelligible words at her, as though they were having a conversation. Margaret lets him do this for a few minutes with a look of glee and rage. Then she realizes her arms are free. John is no longer holding her down with a strong hand. She thrusts upward and grips the ski mask. Before JN knows what is happening, Margaret has grabbed the ski mask and thrown it across the room. This is when I realize Margaret's previous words were absolutely true. John had no face. Of course he does have a face. There is something holding his eyes in. There is a resemblance of nostrils and a gaping hole of a mouth, but his entire head is covered in horrible burns. His face is made up of scar tissue that was twisted and crumpled like dull red roots. He had no eyebrows or lips. just disgusting flesh mounds around his teeth, of which he has very few. Panicked, John dives off Margaret and runs to get the mask. Margaret gets to her feet in seconds. She grabs the camera and begins running. She runs through the house and gets to the front door. She tries the doorknob, but it won't budge. Margaret screams at the door and turns to try somewhere else, but suddenly there was John blocking her way. Margaret lets out a small terrified shriek and drops the camera. The scene turns to yellow before ending. I wanted to stop. Any normal person would call the police, get out of the house, or at least delete the files. I was inexplicably tied to the suffering of Helen and Margaret. Revoltingly, I was also drawn to the madness of John. Maybe I was mad. My hand tapped the mouse to start the next video. The door starts with the picture of the small structure from the first video. It flashes and distorts, switching quickly to John talking into the camera. He's in the house with Helen.
Helen's stomach is large, and it looks clear that she's pregnant. There's something odd sitting on her belly. It looks like a jawbone. John circles Helen, who stares at the ground. She has given up hope. The anger and rage I saw in previous tapes had been replaced with hopelessness. John zooms in on her stomach, and the jawbone, the stubs of her legs are all so visible. It seems like John wants to show Helen off. John says, "Say it." Helen clicks her lips. She replies, "No, the whole thing." She starts to cry quietly. "Chum," she says sadly. John makes small happy noises. "Now raise your claws." Helen slowly raises her arms in the air. For the first time her underarms are visible. Both have identical tattoos of a key. The key was crude with an S shape at the end. She holds her hands up until John grunts. She drops her arms to her sides. In a quiet, sad voice she asks, "Why don't you just kill me?" John zooms out on the scene. Margaret is creeping in the backyard, but neither adults notice her. "I don't kill with my gun, please, Johnny. I can't do this," she begs. "You just haven't moved on yet." He responds. He is calm. Her desperation has almost no effect on him. Helen picks up the jawbone and studies it. Then, like a lightning strike, she stabs herself in the neck. John screams and drops the camera. The bone sticks out of Helen's neck like a stray hair. She spitters blood, filling her windpipe. John is panicking. He pulls the bone out as quickly as possible, but this just causes more blood loss. Helen is smiling. John calls out, "Girl, come here, help." I assume he was referring to Margaret, but Margaret does not come. John scrambles for a second before calling her again, yet she does not arrive. Reluctantly, John leaves Helen to go find Margaret. The screen is filled with Helen gradually leading out. She coughs on her own blood but looks content. Helen looks right at the camera. She tries to say something, but it's hard to make out since the fluid was overcoming her mouth and throat. But she might have said, "Joke's on you." Margaret creeps into the room behind Helen. She briefly touches her hair. It is the touch of deep love. Margaret's face is full of regret. She picks up the camera, whispering pleasant nights before leaving the room. She walks quietly around the house until she reaches the front door. It is open. John is outside screaming, yelling for the girl. She sneaks through the doorway crouching. She circles behind the house and then she takes off running. The camera bounces as she sprints away. John's long scream can be heard in the background. Margaret breathes heavily. The scene cuts between the structure and footage of her running. The sun moves in the sky. Margaret runs with the energy of someone who might never run again. Finally, the scene switches to the footage from the very first video origin. Now it is clear that Margaret is the one holding the camera, walking around the structure with the altar inside. There is a crunch from behind her and she hides. After a few moments, the scene is cut abruptly. The video was over. Instead of relief, panic drenched my body. I was trying to understand what happened. Did Margaret escape? Where was she anyway? Who was Helen and John to her? How did she get there? My fingers shook. And where is she now? I would find out as the next video began to play. Margaret is not. Margaret is completely different than the rest of the videos. It is not shot by a handheld camera in a creepy house. Instead, it is a clip of a talk show. It looks like it had been shot in the early 2000s. And the host is a warm older man who closes his eyes when he talks. A round of applause begins the video. The man is sitting in a comfortable chair with a much less comfortable one across from him. He smiles as the clapping stops. He leans forward and puts his hands together. "Today we are meeting a very special girl," he solemnly says, "a girl who has gone through more than any person, let alone a little girl. should ever go through. Her identity has been obscured for many years to protect her from her ascent. However, now that she has turned 18, she wants to tell her side of the story. The man stood. Please join me in welcoming Tabitha. The audience erupts and floss slowly. Someone enters the stage. She's a small woman with short cut hair. She walks with a bit of a limp. Her dress is plain. If you walked by her you would never notice her, but with the giant lights shining down upon her tiny frame, she is exposed. She turns her face instinctively away from the camera. It takes her entirely too long to cross the set and sit in the chair. I reached my hand up and touched the screen. The woman looked so familiar. She had the same eyes as Margaret. In fact, the more I stared, there was no doubt this was Margaret as a grown-up. But there was something else I recognized, something too close to admit. The man on screen moves to hug Tabitha, but she shrinks back. He adapts quickly and sits in his chair. The applause stops. He looks pityingly at Tabitha. Welcome, my dear. She nods her head but says nothing. The man compensates. We're so happy to have you with us to share your story. All of us remember the Indian Lake maniac. It had a huge impact not only on Wisconsin but on the entire country. The man called John, whose identity could never be verified, tortured and terrified you and your mother for years. Tell us, how did you survive this? Tabitha raises her voice. Her voice was not hesitant. It sounded like Margaret's voice, and I separated myself from what was happening around me. What do you mean by that? Probes the host. It was still me, but I was also far away. Maybe I was walking on the beach or sleeping under the stars, but I knew my body was there and my real brain was there. She takes a breath. I was locked in that house, but my imagination could wander anywhere I wanted. That's so brave. The man responds. Some people in the audience start to cry, others hug each other. Tabias sees them but doesn't seem to understand their behavior. The host continues. What exactly did John do to you? Tabias stens. Why do you want to know that? The man clears his throat. The man clearly is not prepared for the odd woman. Maybe a better question would be, how did you escape? Tabitha smiles. Finally, he called her Helen, not her real name. I don't remember her real name. The world has moved on, but before it moved on, we hatched a plan. She was pregnant with my second little brother. The first John killed, but the second my mother killed. She told me, she said, when you hear John yell, you hide. You find that secret place and hide from him. Then when he opens the door to look for you, you run across the beam and get out. Keep running, run until you don't have legs anymore. That's what she said. That's what I did. The host begins to talk, but Tabitha interrupts him. I made it to the beam and I ran all the way to where he left Jake, and that's what he called him, Jake. I don't remember his real name. His body was gone, but I could still smell him. He mutated into something different. He was in the ground. Now I hid behind the chapel until John was gone. I stayed there for days. A man and a woman found me. I was almost dead, almost gone, almost with my little brother. They told me I was lucky they found me. They made me go over everything he did in detail. They poked my body in the same place as he did, and then they forgot about me. Like I said, the world moved on. The man is speechless. Tabitha doesn't care. He called me Margaret, but I won't let him name me. Giving something a name gives it power. I had a name before the world moved on, but that wasn't me either, so I named myself Margaret. Died at Indian Lake. She died just as much as my mother, just as much as my brother, and just as much as Shardik the bear and the rest. The host waits a few moments before putting on his fake smile. He turns to the camera. We'll be right back with Tabitha, the only survivor of the Indian Lake maniac. The footage stops on a close-up of Tabitha's face. If you look closely, you can see an oddle-looking eye tattooed on her collarbone. The video then goes to black. I could barely breathe. I touched my own collarbone. There under my skin lay my own tattoo. It was the same odd-shaped eye in red ink. It came to me in a dream or so. I thought. I blinked and felt woozy. I hadn't eaten all day. This was normal. I was used to going many hours without eating, but at the moment I felt close to passing out. My small apartment was growing even smaller, and I noticed the clutter for the first time. My chest hurt. All of a sudden the memory card activated. There was one file on it. It opened without me touching it. The footage made me gasp. It was of me in the back of my head. I was doing something on my computer, and there was a brown paper bag next to me, some scotch tape, and a large black marker. After a few minutes I ejected something from the computer, and it was her. DVPD. Carefully, I pulled out the wooden bear from my pocket and wrapped them both in brown paper with care. I wrote my name on the front tab. I put in another DVD to burn while I was working. I started to draw. I awkwardly created a rose on a piece of construction paper. When the DVD was ready, I threw both in a black trash bag. I put the bag under the table and the package in my arms. I then stood and turned to the camera. I smiled into the lens, leaning forward, lips almost touching. I whispered, "Warm day and pleasant nights." Then I turned the camera off. An odd sensation washed over me. I felt like I had seen that footage before. How long? And I had been sitting at this table. My apartment felt foreign, and I wanted to leave, but before I could, I took the camera and put the memory card back into it. I reached into my pocket and found not the bear but rather a pair of batteries. I placed them in the camera, turned it on, and put it back between my two favorite books on writing and Song of Season. I stumbled towards the door, eager to get some fresh air, and I had to leave this place, and I ran across the floor. When I opened it, a small package lay on the porch. I paused for a moment. I had forgotten why I even come to the door in the first place. I picked up the box and took it inside. Is it so strange to open a box on your doorstep? It was addressed to me. That means it was mine. Of course I would open it. Hey everybody, I hope you guys liked my narration of this series. It looks like this is the last. I'm the last one personally.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you liked this story, subscribe to our channel. Leave a like and see you next story.